what I expect to happen is I want people to say, anytime, like even with our podcast and with our YouTube channel, I want people to say, what did he say? Is that the truth? And I want them to go do their own research. Because if you do your own research, it's easy to believe yourself. It's easy to believe yourself. Like the people that just believe me, those are just sheep. Those are just sheep. I want the guy to say, you know what, that doesn't sound right. What do you mean somebody, they're giving reparations in 1865? Or what are they crying about? Oh, wait a minute. Is this really why Lincoln got killed? I want to provoke those mind thoughts. I want people to think, if Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, why kill him afterwards? So it's too late. But they kill him after Field Order 15.
Hey, this is Greg Hoyt from the Breakdown, and we have a special episode this afternoon. I'm joined by the individual Casey Benefield, best known for his work with Better Benefield, and you recently got brought on to AM radio gig. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that, Casey?
Well, there it goes. I think what you're mentioning is the AM radio, the enlightenment of the mind. Our podcast, No Apologies, was picked up on Enlightenment of the Mind, so we'll be able to be broadcast not just through the state of Colorado, but if everything goes well with the first couple episodes, we'll be able to be heard in Tampa, Atlanta, Phoenix, and Detroit. So it's a good thing right now.
Awesome. And so today we're going to be having a unique discussion, one that's going to be like devoid of hostility and things of that nature, but discussing the ethics and the practicality of reparations for foundational Black Americans. You being a Black American, obviously it's going to be a subject that you are personally vested in. You have a vested interest, and with good reason. But I think it's a topic that concerns all Americans based upon the fact that if a reparations program comes into existence, it's one of those things where it's going to be all Americans on deck, picking up the proverbial tab, if you will. So I'll ask you outright, and I want you to state your position. Do you believe that the concept of reparations is ethical and moral as of today?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me on, because I believe this is a conversation that needs to be had. Second, what you just did is one of the major problems. You said Americans are going to be picking the tab, as if African Americans that are in need of reparations, are owed reparations, is somehow not American. That's the problem that we're having. A lot of times people are making it seem like this is a handout. I don't know if you're familiar with Field Order 15. Field Order 15 was issued by General Sherman in 1865, stating that in order to free the slaves, this country, the United States, should give out land in a parcel of 40 acres. You're familiar with the 40 acres and a mule?
Yeah.
And how people have, okay. Well, that's where this came from. So in 1865, the United States said that in order to free the slaves, they need reparations. He said, give them 40 acres, parcel of land, a mule, and also a rifle to protect it, because the cavalry that he was leading, the Mississippi Cavalry, was removing and confiscating land from the Confederates. So he was of the mindset that not only do we have to give them this land, but we have to give them a weapon to protect it, because that's the only way reparations will work. That came over, and around 1866, I want to say, the order was rescinded by the same government. So not only did the United States know that we needed reparations, but by them taking the order back, they were in essence trying to keep us oppressed.
Okay. All right. So obviously this is something where you've done, your stuff. You studied your history, so at least like the period in which slavery was coming to an end, but there were still caveats associated with fully reintegrating, or not reintegrating, fully integrating into American society as free individuals. So I've got a bit of a softball question, because I know it's going to be one of those things where if I don't ask it, because it's one of the most common arguments brought up against reparations, somebody will be like, why didn't you ask this type of thing? So I know it's probably going to be softball for you. But a common argument, and I'm sure you've seen it, is no Black Americans today nor any that were born in the past 160 years were slaves. Same goes for that aforementioned time period where, you know, there were no white slave owners, you know, post 1865 or what have you. And, you know, there are
Right.
no slave owners today. So what is your stance on that argument? Because even though it's a little bit, you know, maybe overused or it's, you know, kind of cliche, it doesn't, you know, mean it's without merit just because it's been around for a while and often cited. So what's your take on that?
Okay, so that's a fairly decent question, but the answer is still the same. So if they knew in 1865 that reparations were needed, and there's proof that in 1865, I'm in contact with a couple of families that actually got their reparations and are doing well, it will be the exact same reparations that was paid to the Holocaust survivors. They gave the Holocaust survivors 90 billion, but they also paid the state of Israel 20 billion. Now, none of those people were in camps. It was more or less that the suffering that incurred because of the atrocity against the Jews, this is reparations for that period. Because of all the things that happened in Black America, from building this country and not being paid for it, and then being enslaved, and then after enslavement, they started prisons. This is why reparations are needed. Now, a lot of people are saying that it will bankrupt the government. You have 40 million Black people in the United States, and the numbers that the economists are coming up with is 9 trillion. That's a real number. But the United States being fiscally irresponsible and not paying when they had an opportunity to, that really doesn't fall on us. That's not our fault.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I was sorry, I've got a dog. I was wondering whether or not you were going to bring up the Holocaust, because there is good parallels, but there's also differences associated with addressing reparations today, you know, approximately 160 years after the fact, after it should have been implemented, versus the reparations that Germany had put into place to address the survivors of the Holocaust. One of the first being, outside of like the money just given directly to Israel, there is literally a Holocaust Survivors Fund, which I think as of 2019, in that year alone, there was approximately 400,000 survivors or something like that had benefited.
432.
Yeah. But so that is a reparation for the direct survivors of the Holocaust. And it was also implemented in the 1950s. So we're talking about something that was brought into motion approximately 5-10 years after the atrocities associated with the Holocaust. I think there's a little bit, well, not a little bit, a lot of bit of nuance between direct survivors of the Holocaust versus descendants of slavery, you know, getting reparations 160 years too late. What is your take on that? And you know, do you find that you may run into more road bumps, be them ethical or, you know, even practical, trying to get something like that implemented?
Okay, so what you said basically leads credence to my argument. You said 5 to 10 years after Germany decided to pay the Holocaust, so that 5 to 10 year window. Reparations was issued during the victory lap of the Civil War. This was in real time. Sherman, in this day and age, would be a 5-star general. So not only is our tanks are still named after General Sherman, the Sherman tank. Not only should his opinion been counted, but it was in real time. He said the only way this is going to work, and this is Field Order 15, is we can't just free the slaves. We have got to give them an opportunity to succeed. Not a handout. Not a handout. If you look at the history of this country, what came from the ending of the Civil War was sharecropping. Sharecropping came into existence because the slaves that were free but had nowhere to go. That's why they became sharecroppers. They were like, you know what? We'll take minimum wage for a shelter and do the job that we were doing for free. See, that's another handout. That doesn't help. That's aid, that's not help. The reason they rescinded the order was because they keep us oppressed. And when I say us, I mean the entire Black community. Because you look at the timeline, you look at where we are now, and then a lot of economists say, well, there's no way we could pay for everything that we did. If this was a court of law, and let's say the United States was a company, the courts would not care what they could pay. They would start garnishing wages. Why would that be any different with us? It's not what we want, it's what we're owed.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's one of those things where, from just a straight across the board, from a certain ethical perspective, insofar of like the history of Black Americans in this country, you're not going to get too much fight out of me if somebody says like, reparations is a good idea. We should do it. We should get something in motion. I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea. I'm like most people. I like that pie in the sky type of stuff. But I know that there is a large number of people that probably would want to be completely hands off of it, because they would say, not only am I not a slave owner, never owned a slave, my parents never owned one, so on and so forth. They bring up that argument. They could also go so far as to say, and my historical lineage has never owned a slave, so why am I part of the party? And it's actually not too far
because
off.
they benefited from slavery.
Well, that's a little bit of a that's kind of difficult to really illustrate, because I often hear people say everybody has benefited from slavery. If you go into the numbers, and
This
so
country as a whole.
well, we'll go into the numbers.
Well, see,
and,
I'm taking away. Go ahead.
yeah, so all we can do is really at least look at the numbers and see, where slaves were, what percentage of Americans owned them, so on and so forth. So during the 1860 census, during that period where it was ostensibly probably one of the highest periods of slavery in terms of number of slaves and slave owners, about 1.4% of Americans, equating to about 393,000 Americans, owned slaves, and it was about a 10-to-1 ratio on average. There were roughly 3.9 million slaves in the United States, according to the 1860 census. So while slave owners don't necessarily mean everybody who benefited from slavery, you could probably expand it to the family, because you know your history about slavery, particularly in the South, where slavery was like some families' bread and butter. That was their business. So even if you were to expand it to the immediate, yeah, so if you expanded it to the immediate family of that 1.4% of Americans in existence at that time, you could bring it out to like maybe slavery directly benefited. You have direct descendants benefiting from slavery at about the 7.5% marker. But also that was a point in time where there was only 31 million Americans in the country, with 3.9 of those individuals, 3.9 million of those individuals being slaves. So how would you address, say, the approximate 92.5, 93% of direct descendants who have no ties to slavery in this country?
Okay, so let me address that. That's a fair question, but I have a resolute answer. When you look at a company such as Jack Daniel's recipe was basically from one of his slaves. That recipe turned into a conglomerate in the liquor industry. So that means that every person who purchased a bottle of Jack Daniel's liquor, they were tantamount to benefiting from slavery. That's a fact. There's no way around that. It doesn't matter if Jack Daniel's owned another slave. Doesn't matter if Jack Daniel's great granddaughter or grandson did not own a slave. They benefited off the backs of slavery. The same can be said whether it be a cotton gin, the Del Monte produce with watermelon out of North Carolina. There is no way for economists to actually separate who did or did not benefit, because the country of the United States benefited from slavery. If it did not, then why rescind the order? See, the reason they opened up prisons is because they needed free labor. That's what the Juneteenth is, the celebration of all the slaves finding out they were free. And on June 20th, the first prison camp was open because somebody had to pick the cotton. Somebody had to do the, when you talk about slavery, you have to remember that the families of white women, the Black slave women took care of the children. That's where you get the term, hey, go ask your mammy, not your mommy. So when you break it down from babysitting to sharecropping, every person in this country, whether they got a small piece of information that they pass forward, or whether they got direct contact from a slave or a slave ideal, they got a benefit from slavery. And it was free.
Yeah, no, okay. Now
But
I understand that wholeheartedly. Yeah. I would not argue in any way, shape, or form that America as a whole at the time, especially when you look at the population comparison, 1 out of 10 Americans, or about 13% of the population in the United States in 1860, were Black Americans, foundational Black Americans. They were slaves. Well, actually, 90% of that 13% were slave. About approximately 10% were free Black men, which that's a completely different can of worms and a much more convoluted subject. But yeah, I would say,
I agree.
yeah, people's lives were enriched, benefit in some way, shape, or form, whether it just be like a small iota, as you mentioned, like somebody who picked up a bottle of Jack Daniels and they had that first sip of that whiskey. But that's still going to be a very hard sell. While I can see it, I can see the perspective, that America as a whole was enriched by the contributions of foundational Black Americans, and thus everyone's lives and generations have been enriched in some way, shape, or form. Not necessarily monetarily, but enrichment. Like when I think of enrichment, you read a good book, you read a Harry Potter book or something like that. Your life has been enriched by entertainment. Enrichment comes in many forms, but that's still a hard sell. And, that will push some people's personal ethical, moral boundaries, because they're still going to be like, I shouldn't have to pick up the tab. So what would be your most convincing argument to get the most, a hesitant person on board?
So if we start and we date ourselves back to 1865 and say that reparations was needed, and we agree that reparations were actually put in place and then it was rescinded. Let's go back a little further. Even when Pharaoh freed the Hebrew slaves left Egypt with as much gold and silver as they could carry, along with rations and everything that they needed. Those were a form of reparations. Like that's what life is. If you've given someone a slighted hand or an injustice, sometimes monetary gain is the only way to fix that problem. Case in point, companies now are getting $26,000 for every employee that they employed during COVID. The American public is going to pick that tab up too. Why would it be different with reparations? It seems like the real argument is, why do we give the Black people money? Like that really seems like the Native Americans have a form of reparations, the schooling, healthcare, things of that nature. It seems like every time that the conversation, because people are making it seem like reparations was Joe Biden's idea, or this just came about. No, the reparations talk has been going back and forth for a long, long time. And you've had people saying that this is the way we get there, this is what's owed, and how do you know who's entitled to it? How do you know whose family is supposed to be paid? Things of that nature. No one is really answering the main question. The main question is, do you believe ethically that the United States enslaved people and took advantage of them? And if the answer is yes, then they should be compensated.
Interesting. And and I will say, no, that's ostensibly that's one of the most convincing arguments that really can be presented. And I'm sure there's still going to be naysayers out there, from the ethical perspective. And I think it stems a lot from, people who raise an eyebrow with what folks would call social justice or restorative justice. It's got a lot of names, but basically what it is writing or attempting to right a historical wrong that may not be within arm's reach, like something like slavery. I mean, it's something that was upended. It was an institution upended 160 some odd years ago. So it's not exactly within arm's reach. So you have proponents of social justice, restorative justice, that say, hey, we need to rectify this. And they also, with the intersectionality that comes with that, they want to address a lot of things. You know as well as I do, as well as a lot of people, that history is very complicated, not just here in the United States, all over the world, with hundreds and hundreds of years worth of atrocities to go around, that could probably use some attention in the restorative justice realm. But would you think, as a global rule, like not just here in the United States, but all across the world, we should figure out whose ancestors did what to whom, and have their respective governments return or reimburse goods, services, lands that may have been illicitly or immorally obtained at the time, even if it were the law of the land? Do you think that is a good global policy? Because it begs questions like, how far back do you go?
I do, and I believe that the starting board should be the reparations to the Black community, because if the United States takes a stance, because they've always said that they're the beacon of the world, if the United States starts by saying we wronged for 400 years plus some, and we're now trying to fix that atrocity, then the United States can say with a straight face, let's give back the land that we also took from Mexico. Let us address that. Let us address what we did to the Native American community. We have to have a starting point. That is my main goal. And when people are saying that, well, it's so much money, how do you know what's owed? How do you get to that number? How do you pay that much money? I have an answer for that. It's 40 million plus, give or take, of African Americans in the United States. And at about 233,000 is what the economist said would be the amount owed in 1800. It comes to about 9.8 trillion is what the United States owed. So my concept would be, the first thing they should do is you take away all of the debt in this country that Black people have, whether it be school, mortgage, car loans, healthcare, and you subtract that from the 9.8 trillion. And then for the 400 years that they were enslaved, you want to give us 400 years of premium healthcare, 400 years of no taxes, 400 years of free education at great learning institutions, higher learning institutions. But that doesn't mean anybody just gets into the school. So if you have somebody who has the grades or the SAT scores to get into Harvard, but doesn't have the finance to get into Harvard, but has the grades to get into, say, Arizona State, that person can still go to school, but you allow their academia to decide what school they attend. And once you get that number down, then you start looking at things like the gold that's on reserve. You start looking at the oil. I don't want land, because what land does, it keeps me trapped here. And also the land can be devalued, or like you saw, I don't know if you're familiar with what's going on in Newport Beach, where the family, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, signed over reparations, saying that this family could not be forced out by the city to give up their land. And now the land's worth like 20 million, the family wants to sell it. I don't want them to be able to have a say in what I do with my money or how I get it. So it's not just me asking for reparations. I have a real plan as to how we get there. The question that's gonna beg everyone is, if you in your heart of hearts believe that slavery existed, and you believe that people were wronged and people benefited, like any civil case, you have got to be able to say that they need this and they're owed this. That's really what it comes down to. Everything else is irrelevant. We need to find real numbers, and we need to start making real moves to get those numbers and to get things done. We need to stop talking about it, because me coming on your show and saying, hey, we need reparations, and no one having an idea, like, why are they saying this now? This is not being said now. It's just now that we have access to social media, where now the voices seem like it's louder and there's an echo chamber. Because like I said, I hope when we finish here, you look up Field Order 15. That reparations in real time was needed.
Yeah, no, and I didn't know the actual, name of it. I didn't know it had a, I wasn't familiar with the specific name, Field Order 15. But I was familiar, yes, with the 40 acres and a mule kind of adage that has, been around for, I don't know, decades, as far as I know.
Yeah, that's the name of Spike Lee's show.
Yeah, and it's actually good what you just went into, what you were just talking about, ideally what a reparation program could look like. You kind of shifted. You shifted very well into the practicality of it, because part of the practicality is, what does a reparations program in the United States, if it were ever to come to fruition, what would it look like? Could it be, brought into motion and run successfully? So let me ask you this. Do you honestly believe this current administration, or even the next one, or even the next 5 administrations, do you think they could make reparations a reality through Congress?
I believe that because of the pressure that President Biden is experiencing now outside of the Black community about the reparations, because he ran on that. That was one of the things that he ran on. I believe that Governor Newsom in California, because he's putting a program together now that can be implemented from a large state like California to be put into place for the entire country. If you take the real numbers, not these made up numbers where they say every Black person is owed $1 million and 200 acres of land. Like, I'm talking about real numbers. If you subtract all of the Black debt in this country, and then you put 400 years of free education, 400 years of healthcare, and 400 years of no state or federal tax, and you subtract that number, then you start getting down into the hundreds of billions versus the trillions of dollars. If it gets down to the hundreds of billions of dollars, then we can start talking numbers such as the 8,020 tons of gold the United States has on reserve right now. And then you start talking about the oil reserve. The United States is 11th in crude oil. If you allow me the second, so what I would do is, if you give me 10 refineries and you make these Black-owned refineries, and then you start giving us barrels of oil monthly, and then you allow us to not only have these barrels of oil, but to refine it and have our own gas, then we can start having Black-owned gas stations. This not only boosts the economy and puts money back into the economy, but it also pays off the debt. There's got to be a system where you can put the money out and have the money reinvested so that you don't bankrupt the country. Because if Congress says we're going to bankrupt the country, of course they're not going to do it. But if you tell them that we have a way to pay what is owed and generate money to put that money back, then there's something they can really look at. Now, I don't know if this administration will get it done, but I'm thinking that because of the pressure he's getting, they're going to start the groundwork. I believe that the swell going through the Black and brown community about these reparations is not going to go away. And I believe that it shouldn't go away. But I also believe that once they start hearing real numbers and saying, hey, this is obtainable, then we'll start having progress. It may not be this administration. Let's say it's 4 more years of this administration. The funny thing about this country, and the people, they're going to be able to go back 10, 15 years from now and look at this interview you and I are doing, it's probably going to get changed under a Republican administration. That's probably what's going to happen. And it's going to be one of those things where a Republican says, hey, I'll give you this tit for tat if you give me that. It's going to be just like the prison reform, like everything else that they want to get done. It's a big project, but it's got to have a starting point. And they have to have real tangible numbers to say, well, this is doable if we get it down to this. And by getting it down to this, we subtract what is owed to what we owe. And then we have a medium where we can say, okay, this is something that can be paid out.
Well, it's interesting when you kind of dive deeper into how, at least how you envision a reparations program would work. Because, you know, a lot of people that are skeptical about reparations, or people who legitimately want them, you know, maybe Black Americans, they kind of like the idea of I call it the reparations lottery, kind of like that old Dave Chappelle skit, everybody gets hit with a lump sum. But what you described sounds more like, you know, there were generational wrongs in the past. So in order to appropriately fix it, we have to mobilize something that behooves generations over time. You know, like as you were saying, you know, something to the effect of about 400 years of world-class healthcare and being relieved of tax burdens.
Yes.
And that actually makes
Yes.
the potential of something like a reparations package, it makes it more palatable and more realistic to accomplish. Yeah, because you know, the federal government collects, what is it, like 3.5 trillion a year in taxes or something like that. And then if it just comes up for a bill one day, all right, we need 9.5. Like, you know, you can't get blood from a stone. So
Right.
yeah, it's kind of like, you know,
but that's, you have to have a plan where,
no, go ahead.
where people can actually see not only that it will work, but it will satisfy both sides. You don't want to have a deal where somebody comes out of the deal feeling that someone got over on them. So if you're telling me that it's 233,000 per Black person, like I said, if you're telling me I can not pay taxes and my family's doesn't pay taxes for 400 years, and then you tell me on top of that, this is what premium healthcare costs, and you subtract that number, and then you say top rate education, and you subtract that number, then you start getting into the hundreds of millions of dollars, or hundreds of billions, I'm sorry, versus the trillions of dollars. And then it starts to become something that's tangible, because it's not going to be a situation where Black people just put an ATM card into the machine and then money starts pouring out. It cannot be that way. It won't be that way. But if you're telling me that I have a percentage of this, a percentage of that, and you stop charging me this and you stop charging me that, then it easily becomes something that is real, no longer talk. And then you start slowly but surely, you start putting layers of legislation together, and you get a few sentences, you know what, that's something that's doable. That's something that we can do. But it's also got to be in the mindset that Black America is still America. Okay. Would we be having this conversation if this was white America that was owed money? Would that still be, would people still be skeptical? Like seriously, would we still be saying, oh, no, no, we want to give them that money? It has to be looked upon as this isn't a Black American problem. This is an American problem because it's part of American history, and America benefited from the lives and livelihood of slavery.
All right, so it's a little bit of a funny note on the practicality of it, because, you know, there's only going to be realistically one of two ways that a reparations program could be implemented in terms of there being benefactors. Option A would be any Black American in the country today and moving forward behooves from a, you know, reparations benefit package. Or B, you find the direct descendants of slaves, foundational Black Americans. Now, I think probably the latter is the most fair in terms of, you know, equitable, because it's helping the descendants of foundational Black Americans. But then again, you also might have Black Americans today that would be a little bit upset. But you'd also inadvertently, if you go the lineage route, you'd probably wind up with white people, like white appearing people, inadvertently getting some kind of scratch off the top. What are your thoughts on that? Do you look at that like, if that were to happen, would you be like, would you not really care just so long as the broader population of Black Americans, foundational Black Americans, got what was coming for them?
Well, see, that's another misunderstanding. Sherman was a white guy. General Sherman was white. So we know that there were white people that believed reparations were necessary. Mm-hmm. There were also white abolitionists that were helping. And if nothing else, we've learned, if we look at the whole Kyle Rittenhouse situation, there are white people that are standing and have always stood with Black people. And that's what it's going to take for us to move forward. So if a white person's lineage says that, hey, this white person was in close proximity to slavery and family could have been slaves or had slave blood and they are owed money as well, why wouldn't I want that? Because that would be another American getting what they owe. See, my mindset is not saying that this is a Black problem. My mindset is saying this is an American problem. And every American that was victim to this atrocity should get reparations. And I stand on that. It's not the color of the man, it's the atrocity behind the man himself that is why he's owed reparations.
Well, I gotta say, you know, for a short of brief of the conversation that we had, I think we touched on some great points. I think a lot of people who have an opportunity to see this interview, they're going to walk away with a more expanded mind, regardless
Absolutely.
of what position they came from, whether they are a reparations skeptic or pro reparations. They're at least going to have a more full picture, and they'll probably get a better understanding of the critics and, you know, pro stances of reparations, which that's the whole idea. So, you know, last minute, really quick here. Why don't you go ahead and tell the folks where they can find you?
Okay. First of all, thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed this conversation. I believe that we got a lot of things covered. Better Benefield, our YouTube channel, has now, we produce our podcast, No Apologies. No Apologies will be seen or heard on 12:30 a.m. radio here in Colorado, at 10:30 a.m. on Sundays. Our podcast is, if it's not weekly, it will be bi-weekly. I got a great team with me now. You see all the fancy lights. We got a few things in the works. Life is good, man. And I really do appreciate your stance on this, because we're going to need you and your viewers and those that didn't have the knowledge to have a better understanding as to where this is coming from. And I want, if nothing else, for people to realize this is not my problem. This is an American problem. We shouldn't have to come together every time on tragedy, but this is a tragedy, no matter how long ago it was, that we all should come together on and try to find a solution.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you again for coming on the show, and I'm looking forward to conversing with more down the line about this topic.
Thank you.